We're moving along with the story of Abraham. In the 19th chapter of Genesis, there is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which you might say is more about Lot than it is Abraham. But still, we're in the general vicinity of Abraham. Isaac will soon be born, and Abraham will be commanded to offer him as an offering to the Lord. And so we will study those as a separate lesson, and then move into Isaac. Isaac has the least said about him of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The least is said about Isaac. There is a story about Isaac going into the land of the Philistines and meeting a king by the name of Abimelech. That is, it seems very similar to the story about Abraham going into that area and meeting a king with the same name. And it may be that Abimelech we ought to understand as a generic name for a ruler of that part of the world, maybe like Pharaoh for the land of Egypt. But anyway, we last talked about Abraham when he was on the way with one of the angels that had stayed behind from the others, the angel who is called Yahweh, who is given the divine name. It may be that he is to be understood as a special representative in some way of Yahweh, but many people find in him the angel of the Lord and believe that he appears at various cases, in various instances throughout the Bible. But he stays behind with Abraham, and Abraham has the conversation with him about, well, suppose that there are 50 lacking 10, and suppose that of the 40, 10 more are lacking, until they finally get it down to 10. And Yahweh says to Abraham, if there are 10, I will not destroy the city. And then in chapter 19, the scenery changes to the Sodom and Gomorrah, and the two personages that met Abraham on the plain are called angels. And the angels said, that's how chapter 19 begins, and the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. And so before that time, there are three who appear to Abraham. As time goes along, as they talk more, one of the three is identified as Yahweh, and then that one angel stays with Abraham and talks with Abraham while Abraham walks in the direction of Sodom. But the two angels, the two are in front apparently of Abraham, and they arrive there with Lot. Now, as to why this story should be placed at this junction in the story of Abraham's the dealings with God, we don't really know. It isn't told us. We are told in the chapter before, Abraham is given something of a history of how his descendants will be in the land of Egypt. And it is said that the reason it has been delayed is the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And so Sodom may well be a representation of the culture of the Amorites. Sometimes all of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan are called Amorites, and sometimes Canaanites, and sometimes they are broken down into 6 or 7 different peoples. But Amorites would certainly be within the realm of our understanding of the people who live in Canaan, and there being Amorite people. The Bible says that when the two angels got there, they were ready to camp out in the street. They had everything they needed, food and shelter and so forth. Of course, that is a semi-tropical part of the world, and so it may not have been too cold at any time. I've said before, but let me repeat, that when the Jordan River flows in to the Dead Sea, it is the lowest spot below sea level on the earth. So it's a very low country, and it is hot and steamy as you would expect of a low climate like that. I am told that the valley that is extended from the Jordan River and that takes in the Dead Sea, I understand that that valley goes down into Africa further, and that many of the anthropologists have discovered Lucy gets in the news now and then, and there's just a few bones, that were discovered of Lucy's body, but they claim that it was many, many years before the time of Abraham, and that we have one of the first humanoid, that's the terminology that is used, type of beings that come out of the work of the anthropologist in that part of the world. And so it is an area, that whole area there where the Dead Sea is an area that is talked about some. We understand it some from the Bible and some from areas outside the Bible. The location of Sodom is something of a controversy. You remember that when Lot was given a choice, when his uncle Abraham gave him the choice, that he chose the well-watered area of the Jordan. Well, that suggests the Jordan River somewhere at its south end, just before it flows in to the Dead Sea. However, in this lesson today in our reading, Abraham rises up early in the morning and looks out and sees the smoke of Sodom rising when God has destroyed the city. Well, that would make more sense if Abraham looked. Hebron is closer to the southern end of the Dead Sea than to the northern end. And so there are some people who think that we ought to identify Sodom with the southern end of the Dead Sea. At any rate, I do understand that the deeper part of the Dead Sea is at the northern end. There may be more geological pressures in that area. The Bible speaks about there being tar pits and such as that in the area, and so it may well be that that is a sign of something of the going on underneath the ground, much as there is with Yellowstone, say, in the United States. But the exact location of Sodom and Gomorrah is not quite agreed on by everybody, though there are more people, no doubt, who think that we ought to associate Sodom with the northern end of the Dead Sea. Archaeologists have uncovered some text from the ancient world that they have understood, at least, to be a reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. But of course, that's the trouble with archaeology. Archaeology, instead of clearing up problems, sometimes introduces more problems than it satisfies our curiosity on. And it's only a matter of curiosity that we wonder where Sodom is located, because the story is as true with Sodom at the southern end of the Dead Sea as it is at the northern end. It is somewhat interesting, I think, that the deeper part of the Dead Sea, and it is a deep area, I understand, is at the northern point of the Dead Sea. For those of you who are interested in these kinds of things, on the ground, the north western part of the Dead Sea shore is where the Qumran community was located, and the Qumran community is the one that wrote and hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that dates, of course, many years after the time of Abraham, probably 1,800 years or so after Abraham. But at the same time, it is an interesting aspect of our knowledge of the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls brought our knowledge of the Old Testament, I'm say our, the Western world's knowledge of the Old Testament was advanced by several hundreds of years with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Jews have the disconcerting habit of when a scroll is old, if it has the law or some other aspect of the Old Testament attached to it, that scrolls are burned or they are buried. In either case, they are destroyed for all practical purposes if any archaeologist seeks to find them. The only reason that they survived in the area of the Dead Sea is that it's a very dry part of the world, and they were placed back in caves, sometimes put in containers that were especially constructed for them, and the containers were made out of clay material. The Qumran community was a very industrious place. There are a lot of arguments that go on about it, but it no doubt produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The people of Sodom apparently were very wicked, from what little we know about them in the Bible. There isn't much said about Gomorrah or the cities of the plain. It is mostly about Sodom. There's a similar story right at the end of Judges. You might remember that the book of Judges, after telling us of the judges, of the ones who had the longer reigns and the one who that we know very, very little about it, most of the judges, the material that is in the book of Judges is about Gideon and Samson. Those two people get nearly all the press in the book of Judges. But the book of Judges closes with 7 chapters that have nothing whatsoever to do with the judges. But it does give us an insight as to what the story of the judges is about. In that last 7 chapters in the book of Judges, the phrase is found some 4 times, found over and over, virtually the same phrase. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. Now, the stories are not about judges. Micah was of the tribe of Dan, but he certainly isn't a major player in the judges themselves. And then the last 3 chapters are about the Levite and his concubine, and they were in a city of Benjamin. And so we don't really know. I mean, it doesn't appear that those stories are directly connected, although you would, when you read the story of the Levite and his concubine especially, you would think about the story here in Genesis about Abraham. Well, the 2 men come to the city of Sodom. It is interesting, if most of us, if we hear the word sodomite, we think of homosexual. Well, the word has become something of a euphemism, a way of referring to homosexuals that come from the Bible, that comes from the Bible itself. The little book of Judges, Judges talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, or makes a passing reference to Sodom and Gomorrah, and talks about the men of Sodom seeking after the phrase that's used in the King James Version and in several other translations. The men of Sodom sought after strange flesh, it says. So the normal way would be for a man and a woman to be together, but if the way of homosexuality would be referred to as they're seeking strange flesh. And apparently none of the Jews misunderstood that. I think if most of us saw the statement in the context of the book of Jude, we'd understand it that way. One of the other instances where Sodom and Gomorrah is mentioned, or at least where the story is mentioned in the New Testament, the Israelites apparently had a proverb to look back at sin and to desire it. That is, not to put it behind you like a repentant person ought to put sin behind it, to look back at sin and to long for it. remember Lot's wife, Jesus says. Apparently that phrase, remember Lot's wife, had become something of a proverb for the people of Israel, for an individual who didn't turn to God quite all the way, that became a partial convert, if you can be a partial convert to God. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah are mentioned in that way in the New Testament. There is an interesting reference in 2nd Peter, and Lot comes out looking best there of any place that I know of in the Bible. Lot, it says that when he saw the wickedness of the people of Sodom, it vexed his righteous soul. That's the wording of the King James Version. Well, I wouldn't read the story in Genesis and think that there was much that vexed about evil that vexed Lot. I'd hardly call him a righteous man. He seems to have to be more on the side of the people in Sodom. Well, when Sodom encounters the two angels and they're ready to camp out on the street, he says, don't let this happen. Remember hospitality in the Near East. And so Lot invites the two men to spend the night in his house. And while they're there, the men of the city come banging on the door. They want Lot to turn these two men out to them so they can engage in homosexual practices. Lot refuses. This is part of the Near Eastern hospitality. Maybe it is Near Eastern hospitality, but I doubt that many women that live in the ancient world or the modern find much solace in the story. Lot says, here, instead of the two men, let me give you my two daughters. Seems to be pretty casual about it. They were even engaged to be married, but the two men prevent the daughters being turned out to the homosexuals, to those who desired strange flesh. And they beat on the door, and they are stricken with blindness so that they can't... is that in this story? I get the one in Judges mixed up with this one now and then. I think maybe it's in Judges where they are stricken with blindness and can't find the door. But the angels warn Lot to take whatever relatives he has and to get out of the city immediately. There are two men there who plan to marry the daughters of Lot, but they listen to Lot speak and they think that he is just joking about it. I mean, this is a great city and it's going to be all destroyed. And so they refuse to leave. The Bible says that the angels takes Lot by the hand and Lot's wife and the two daughters of Lot. That would be four of them. And then the two angels, of course, have to add them in there somewhere. At least they get out of the city. So there are six of them that leave the city when it's ready to be destroyed. And the Bible says that fire and brimstone came down from God. Now, we would call brimstone sulfur. Burning sulfur, they tell me, is very painful. I don't know. I never had a sulfur burn. But God causes fire and brimstone to rain down out of heaven. And Abraham, from where he is in Hebron, sees the destruction coming. And the only people that survive from the city are these six. They get out. And Lot says to the two angels, don't make us go to the mountains immediately. Allow us to go into there's a smaller town nearby, Zoar. Let us go there and let me catch my breath at least, Lot says to the angels. And so the angels say, okay, we'll not destroy Zoar. And so they destroy all of the land round about. And it may be, that the pots of tar and such that one would expect in a very low area like that, It may be that it has something to do with the destruction of the city, but it's still a miraculous act. It is God who brings this destruction on Sodom. The story of the Levite and the concubine is very much like that. Instead of two angels, we've got the Levite, and there are some unnamed and an unnamed man that takes the men in during the night, and then of course the concubine of the Levite is turned out to them instead of the daughters of Lot, and she is abused all night, and then it's a gory story of how she is cut into 12 pieces and sent out to the 12 tribes of Israel. But you can very easily get the stories mixed up because they are very similar in many of their details. Well, Lot, the worst thing that could happen to an individual in the ancient world, as the Bible presents it, the worst thing that could happen to a person was that he not have descendants. That was the whole point of the Levirate law. If a man died, then his brother took his wife, and the child took any children that were born took the name of the deceased brother. And so a family name was carried on. Well, the time came when Lot had to leave Zoar. We haven't said anything about Lot's wife. She looked back and became a pillar of salt. I have been to the Dead Sea more than once, and once I went in, and it is really something there. You can see every pebble on the floor of the Dead Sea because there's nothing that grows there. Algae, any kind of green thing just won't grow. It's many times more salty than our Great Salt Lake, for example. But I've often thought, that Lot's wife must have been a pretty big woman. She caused all of that brine and salt in the Dead Sea. But she turns into a pillar of salt, and of course that's emblematic in that the sea is so salty. I doubt that he got all its saltiness from Lot's wife, but at any rate, it was something that happened. The story of Lot's wife is mentioned in the New Testament. As I said, remember Lot's wife in the context where Jesus speaks of that in Luke the 17th chapter, verse 32. The context where it's spoken of is where Jesus warns the disciples about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And so to look back on some terrible way of staying in one's sins, a proverb for the people of Israel was remember Lot's wife. Remember what happened to her when she looked back and longed for the city of Sodom. I suppose that's the implication when it says that she turned back. They were told not all of them were told not to look back, but Lot's wife did, and she turned into a pillar of salt. And so Lot and his daughters then eventually come to the mountains of Moab, on to the east of the Dead Sea. The Jews still call them the mountains of Moab. And so it was there that the sons, or the daughters of Lot, bore children, each of them bore a son, and through incest, and carried on Lot's name. One of the sons was Moab, and the Moabites were traditional enemies of the people of Israel. There is a wadi that flows into the Dead Sea from the west, and or from the east, I guess it flows westward to the Dead Sea, and it is the Wadi Arnon. And apparently John the Baptist preached in that area. But the traditional dividing line between the people of Moab and the people of Israel was the Wadi Arnon. And then to the south, there's one more stream, the Zered, that flows in the same direction, flows from the east into the Dead Sea. There are 4 streams altogether that flow into the Dead Sea, or the River Jordan, or the Dead Sea, one or the other, that come from the east. And on further east is where the Ammonites live. And so these 2 children that bore the name of Israel's enemies, the Moabites and the Amorites. The Amorites are probably best known because when David was warring against, trying to enlarge the territory, his own land that he ruled over, he had a long-standing warfare with the Amorites, and that's when he sent out Joab, his commander, to be in charge of the forces, and that's when he committed the sin with Bathsheba while the battle, or while the warfare was going on between Israel and Ammon. And so I expect that that has something to do with the story. It tells us where those people originated and how shameful their origination was, even though the children themselves didn't do anything wrong. But still, for the people of Israel, for the children to be born of incest would have been a black mark against them, the Amorites and the Moabites. Well, the story concludes with Abraham seeing the destruction that is coming on the city, and God bringing his vengeance against them. Now, we are very soon coming to the time when Isaac is going to be born, and with the sacrifice of Isaac, and that will be for the next lesson. Thank you for the good attention you paid today.